Can you fathom the terror of being systematically stripped of your sanity, your peace by the very children you cherished above all else? Have you ever felt your own home transform into a gilded cage managed by those who claim to love you? I'm Evelyn Thorne, a retired librarian who poured my heart into my children for 43 years. After David, my eldest son, passed away suddenly in a car accident 5 years ago, I showered Rebecca and Daniel with twice the love and support, keeping our family home as a sacred symbol of unity, intending it for them to share equally when my time came. The breaking point arrived with what they called an accident. I was found unconscious at the bottom of our stairs. My body crumpled beside the tampered stair lift that had been my lifeline to the second floor. Rebecca subtly whispered to hospital staff that I was becoming confused, increasingly prone to dangerous falls. When I returned home, they were systematically clearing my belongings, rearranging my furniture, altering my very reality. The chilling truth emerged like ice water in my veins. My own children were orchestrating my systematic downfall, deliberately twisting my perception of reality to make me question my own sanity. But they didn't know about my meticulously kept secret journal, carefully hidden within the pages of old library reference books, documenting every insidious act, every gaslighting comment, every cruel manipulation. They thought they could break my mind with their psychological warfare. They gravely underestimated a librarian's methodical nature and a mother's protective instincts. My sanity, my documented truth, was my hidden weapon. This devastating betrayal was not my end, but the quiet beginning of my fight for survival. I returned home from my 3-day hospital stay, feeling frail and disoriented, my body still aching from the mysterious fall that had left me unconscious at the bottom of our familiar stairs. But the moment I crossed the threshold of the home I had lovingly maintained for over 30 years, something felt subtly disturbingly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Rebecca and Daniel were waiting for me in the living room, both wearing expressions of exaggerated concern that didn't quite reach their eyes. There was something predatory in their attentiveness, a strange glint of anticipation that made my skin crawl with unease. They hovered around me like vultures circling wounded prey, their voices unnaturally sweet and solicitous. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that I had never heard from her before. "Daniel and I have been talking extensively while you were in the hospital, and we've decided it's absolutely best if we start managing your affairs from now on. It's purely for your own safety and well-being, of course." She gestured around the living room with proprietary confidence, as if she were already the owner, rather than a guest in my home. The house obviously needs significant updates and modifications to make it truly safe for someone in your particular condition. We can't risk another dangerous accident like the one that nearly killed you. Daniel nodded eagerly beside her, though I noticed he couldn't meet my direct gaze when I looked at him. His eyes kept darting away nervously, focusing on points beyond my shoulder, as if he were ashamed of something he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge. Their primary focus was clearly on establishing control over my assets and property, though they wrapped their intentions in language of care and concern that felt hollow and manipulative. I tried desperately to protest their presumptuous takeover of my life, summoning what little strength I had left to assert my independence and dignity. But I've been managing my own finances successfully for over 70 years. I said, my voice sounding weaker and more uncertain than I intended. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and making my own decisions about my home and my future. As I looked around the living room more carefully, I began to notice subtle changes that filled me with growing dread. What have you done to the furniture arrangement? Why is my favorite reading chair moved away from the window where I've always kept it. A desperate part of my heart still hoped that their actions were simply misguided attempts at genuine care, that they were worried about my safety and trying to help in their own clumsy way. I wanted to believe that my children were acting out of love rather than the cold calculation I was beginning to suspect. But my fragile hope was quickly shattered when Rebecca brought in Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor, who was notorious throughout the community for her gossip and tendency to spread malicious rumors about anyone who caught her attention. Poor dear Evelyn, Rebecca confided to Mrs. Henderson in a voice loud enough for me to hear clearly, though she pretended I wasn't sitting right there in my own living room. She's become so terribly confused and disoriented since her fall. We're doing our absolute best to care for her, but it's increasingly difficult when she doesn't remember basic things or recognize changes we've made for her own protection. Mrs. Henderson clucked sympathetically, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who had just received fresh material for her neighborhood gossip network. "Oh, you poor children," she cooed. "It must be so difficult dealing with an aging parent who's losing her mental faculties. How fortunate that she has such devoted children to look after her interests." Daniel, emboldened by Mrs. Henderson's presence and Rebecca's lead, added his own contribution to their coordinated character assassination. We've even had to install new locks on all the doors and windows for her safety and security. We can't risk her wandering off and getting lost or hurt when she becomes confused. As they spoke, I became increasingly aware of the disturbing changes that had been made to my home during my brief hospital stay. Furniture had been moved to unfamiliar positions that made navigation difficult and disorienting. Cherished personal items had disappeared, entirely replaced by sterile, institutional-looking objects that held no meaning or comfort for me. Family photographs had been removed from their traditional places on the mantelpiece and side tables, creating empty spaces that felt like gaping wounds in the visual landscape of my memories. Books I had collected over decades were missing from their familiar shelves, making the room feel foreign and unwelcoming. The psychological impact of these changes was devastating and clearly deliberate. Every alteration served to make me feel disoriented and uncertain in my own home, as if I were a stranger, intruding in someone else's space rather than a woman who had lived here for 3 decades. Rebecca and Daniel then produced a thick sheaf of official-looking medical and legal documents, spreading them across my coffee table with the efficiency of people who had clearly planned this moment well in advance. "These are just standard forms, Mom," Rebecca explained with that same chilling smile that never seemed to reach her eyes. "Power of attorney documents, medical directives, financial authorizations, just routine paperwork, so Daniel and I can make important decisions in your best interest when you're not feeling well enough to handle complex matters yourself." Daniel picked up where his sister left off his voice, carrying a subtle threat beneath its surface concern. "And we think it would be safest if you stayed primarily in your bedroom for the next few weeks while you recover from your injuries. We wouldn't want to risk any more accidents or falls while you're still weak and unsteady on your feet." Their tone and body language made it abundantly clear that any refusal to sign their documents or comply with their restrictions would be interpreted as further evidence of my mental incompetence and used to justify even more severe limitations on my freedom and autonomy. I could see the trap they were laying with mathematical precision. Refuse to cooperate and be labeled as irrational and unfit to make my own decisions or comply and surrender my independence voluntarily. Either choice would lead to the same destination, complete control over my life, my home, and my assets. As I sat in my transformed living room, surrounded by the evidence of their systematic manipulation and facing the reality of their coordinated assault on my sanity and independence, I felt the crushing weight of heartbreak, humiliation, and dawning terror settle over me like a suffocating blanket. The days following my return from the hospital brought an escalation in the subtle psychological torment that Rebecca and Daniel had begun during my absence. Their campaign of mental manipulation became more sophisticated and insidious with each passing day, designed to systematically undermine my confidence in my own perceptions and memories. My treasured collection of classic literature began disappearing from the shelves where I had carefully arranged them over decades of collecting. In their place appeared books I had never seen before, lurid romance novels and cheap mystery paperbacks that I would never have chosen to own, much less display in my living room. When I questioned these changes, Rebecca would smile with that same cold expression and say, "Oh, Mom, you bought those yourself last week. Don't you remember our trip to the bookstore? You were so excited about trying new genres." The food situation became equally disturbing and disorienting. Meals would appear on my plate containing ingredients I had always avoided due to allergies or personal preference. Spicy foods that burned my sensitive stomach, seafood, that I had never been able to tolerate vegetables prepared in ways that made them inedible to my palate. When I protested or pushed the food away, Daniel would shake his head sadly and say, "Mom, these are all your favorite dishes. You've always loved salmon and Brussels sprouts. Your memory is playing tricks on you again." They began having whispered conversations outside my bedroom door at all hours of the day and night, their voices just loud enough for me to hear the urgent conspiratorial tone, but not quite clear enough to understand the specific words. When I gathered enough courage to confront them about these secretive discussions, they would instantly transform into expressions of innocent concern. "Poor Mom," Rebecca would say with theatrical sympathy. "You're imagining things again. We were just discussing what to make for dinner tomorrow. You really need to rest more and try not to worry about things that aren't really happening." Each denial of reality felt like another blow to my already fragile sense of self-trust. I began to question not only what I was experiencing in the present, but also my memories of the past and my ability to distinguish between reality and imagination. The truth began to dawn on me with chilling, horrifying clarity as I observed the pattern and coordination of their behavior. This wasn't misguided concern or overprotective care. This was a deliberate, calculated campaign designed to destroy my mental stability and confidence in my own perceptions. They weren't simply trying to exploit my resources or gain control of my property through conventional means. Their objective was far more sinister and complete. They were actively working to break my spirit, to drive me to a state of complete psychological dependence, to make me so confused and uncertain that I would willingly surrender all autonomy and decision-making power to them. Their goal was nothing less than the complete erasure of my identity and independence, not just financially, but mentally and emotionally as well. They wanted to reduce me to a compliant, helpless shell who would sign whatever documents they presented and accept whatever living arrangements they deemed appropriate. As this realization crystallized in my mind, memories of my eldest son, David, came flooding back with painful intensity. His sudden, tragic death in that senseless car accident 5 years ago had torn a gaping hole in my heart that had never fully healed. David had been the responsible one, the protector, the child who had always looked out for his younger siblings and his aging mother. In my grief and desperate need to honor David's memory, I had poured all my love, attention, and financial resources into Rebecca and Daniel's lives. I had tried to give them twice the affection and support they had received before attempting to fill the void left by their brother's absence and ensure they never felt shortchanged or unloved. What I had never told them, what I had kept as my secret sacrifice, was the extent to which I had depleted my own resources to provide for their dreams and ambitions. When my great-aunt Millicent had passed away and left me a substantial inheritance, money that had been intended to secure my own retirement and provide for my care in old age, I had quietly used every penny to pay for Daniel's expensive experimental tutoring program and Rebecca's elite art school education. These opportunities had been far beyond what my modest librarian's salary could have afforded, but I had wanted to give them every advantage David would have wanted them to have. I had given them not just David's share of my love and attention, but his share of my financial legacy as well. The memory of these sacrifices made their current betrayal even more devastating and incomprehensible. How could the children I had loved and supported so generously be capable of such calculated cruelty toward the mother who had given them everything? When I finally found the courage to remind them of these sacrifices in a moment of desperate clarity, hoping to appeal to whatever gratitude or love might still exist in their hearts, Rebecca's response was like a physical blow to my chest. David was always Dad's favorite anyway. She sneered, her voice dripping with years of accumulated resentment. You just tried to buy our love after he died because you felt guilty about how much more attention you gave him when he was alive. And frankly, your guilt money didn't work. You're the reason we're both so emotionally damaged and unable to form healthy relationships. Daniel, looking to his sister for approval before speaking, mumbled his agreement with obvious discomfort but clear determination to support her narrative. Yeah, Mom, you were always too soft with us, too needy for our approval. It made us weak and dependent instead of strong and independent like David was. They had taken my profound grief over losing David and my genuine desire to honor his memory by caring for his siblings and twisted it into evidence of my own selfishness and inadequacy as a mother. My unconditional love had been reframed as manipulation, my sacrifices dismissed as failed attempts at purchasing affection. The final blow came when Rebecca produced yet another set of legal documents, these ones bearing the letterhead of what appeared to be a reputable family law firm. Her smile was triumphant and predatory as she spread the papers across my bedside table. Given your rapidly declining mental health and the increasing burden that maintaining this house has become for all of us, our attorney has advised us to begin the process of applying for legal conservatorship, she announced with the satisfaction of someone delivering a death sentence. We'll be able to manage all your affairs permanently and make all decisions about your care and living arrangements without having to constantly worry about your confused protests or irrational resistance to our help. Daniel nodded eagerly beside her, apparently emboldened by his sister's confidence. And the house will obviously need to be sold as soon as possible. The proceeds can be used to pay for your care in a proper facility where you'll receive the professional supervision you clearly need. It's really for the best, you know. Much less stress and confusion for everyone involved. Their intention was crystal clear and utterly ruthless, complete institutionalization of my person and liquidation of my assets, with themselves as the sole beneficiaries of a lifetime of my work and sacrifice. They had crafted a perfect trap that would leave me with no legal recourse and no ability to defend myself against their coordinated assault on my independence and dignity. 3 days after Rebecca had presented me with the conservatorship papers, I was awakened by the sound of multiple voices in my living room. Through my bedroom door, I could hear Rebecca and Daniel speaking in hushed, urgent tones with someone whose voice I didn't recognize, but whose professional demeanor was unmistakable. When they entered my bedroom, I was confronted by a sight that filled me with dread. Rebecca and Daniel, flanked by a grim-faced woman in a conservative business suit who introduced herself as Mrs. Whitmore, a senior care specialist, who had clearly been brought in to facilitate my removal from my own home. "Mom," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying a chilling coldness that I had never heard from her before, even during our worst arguments. "The conservatorship paperwork is nearly finalized, and we've found what everyone agrees is a lovely facility that will be perfect for someone with your particular needs and limitations." She gestured toward Mrs. Whitmore, who stepped forward with a folder full of glossy brochures and official-looking documents. "Mrs. Whitmore has been working with us to arrange your transition to Sunset Manor, where you'll receive the kind of professional care and supervision that we simply can't provide in a home environment." Daniel, who had been nervously fidgeting with his car keys, finally found his voice. "You're scheduled to be transferred there tomorrow morning, Mom. We've already packed most of your essentials, and the facility has everything else you'll need for a comfortable stay." The casual way they discussed my life, as if I were an object to be relocated rather than a human being with rights and feelings, was breathtaking in its cruelty. They had made these momentous decisions about my future without consulting me, without considering my wishes, without even pretending that my opinion mattered in the slightest. Mrs. Whitmore opened her folder and began describing the facility in the practiced, cheerful tone of someone who had delivered this same speech to countless other elderly victims. Sunset Manor is a state-of-the-art care facility with 24-hour nursing supervision, structured meal programs, and therapeutic activities designed specifically for residents with cognitive decline and mobility limitations. The desperation and terror that had been building in my chest for days suddenly erupted into words that came pouring out of me in a torrent of anguish and disbelief. "Rebecca, Daniel, how can you possibly do this to me?" I pleaded, my voice trembling with emotion and physical weakness. "After everything I've given you, after all these years of love and sacrifice, after keeping this home as a sanctuary for our family's memories, you're just going to ship me off to some institution like an unwanted piece of furniture." I struggled to sit up straighter in my bed, summoning what little strength and dignity I had left to make one final appeal to whatever humanity might still exist in their hearts. "You're destroying our family. You're breaking apart everything your father and I built together, everything David would have wanted preserved. This house isn't just property. It's our history, our legacy, the place where you both grew up and learned what it means to be loved unconditionally." But even as I spoke these words, I could see in their faces that my pleas were falling on completely deaf ears. Daniel couldn't meet my gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor in what might have been shame, but was clearly not enough to change his mind or alter his actions. Rebecca, however, looked directly at me with an expression of cold satisfaction that was more terrifying than outright hatred would have been. Her smile was chillingly triumphant, as if she were savoring this moment of complete victory over someone who had once held authority over her life. "It's for your own good, Mom," she said, with the patronizing tone one might use with a particularly stubborn child. "You're obviously too frail and confused to continue living independently. This arrangement will be much safer and more appropriate for someone in your declining condition." To emphasize her complete disregard for my feelings and history, she then walked over to my dresser and deliberately picked up the antique locket that was perhaps my most treasured possession, a delicate gold piece that contained a lock of David's hair from when he was a baby. It was irreplaceable, priceless, not for its monetary value, but for the memories and love it represented. With calculated cruelty, Rebecca tossed the locket carelessly into a cardboard box filled with old rags and items destined for disposal. This kind of sentimental nonsense is exactly what we need to help you get past, she sneered. Clinging to old memories and meaningless objects is just making your adjustment to reality more difficult. As I watched my most precious keepsake disappear into that box of refuse, something fundamental shifted within me. The crushing despair and helpless terror that had been paralyzing me for days suddenly transformed into something much more powerful and dangerous. A surge of righteous fury that seemed to fill my frail body with strength I hadn't felt in months. You think you've succeeded in breaking me. I stated, my voice surprisingly strong, despite the trembling in my hands. You believe you've managed to destroy my mind and crush my spirit with your psychological warfare and calculated cruelty. I pulled myself up to a sitting position with more determination than I had shown in weeks, my eyes blazing with an intensity that clearly startled both of them. You absolute fools. You've gravely underestimated both a librarian's methodical nature and a mother's protective instincts when her survival is threatened. Rebecca and Daniel exchanged uncertain glances, their confident smirks beginning to fade as they sensed that something had shifted in the power dynamic of our confrontation. You planted that loose rug at the top of the stairs, didn't you, Rebecca? I continued, my voice gaining strength and authority with each accusation. And you, Daniel, you tampered with my stairlift mechanism, making sure it would malfunction at exactly the right moment to send me tumbling down those stairs. Their faces began to pale visibly as I systematically dismantled their carefully constructed fiction of innocent concern. And this locket you just threw away so carelessly, it's not even the original, is it? You replaced it months ago with a replica selling the real one that contained David's actual hair, because you thought I was too senile to notice the difference. Daniel's nervous fidgeting had escalated to obvious panic, while Rebecca's triumphant expression was rapidly being replaced by something approaching fear. What you don't know, I continued, reaching under my pillow to retrieve a small leather-bound journal that I had been keeping hidden for months, is that I've been meticulously documenting every single one of your insidious acts in this secret journal, carefully hidden within the pages of my old library reference books where you would never think to look. I opened the journal to reveal pages covered with my careful handwriting dates, times, and detailed descriptions of their psychological manipulation tactics. This journal contains comprehensive documentation of every missing item, every piece of moved furniture, every gaslighting comment, every subtle sabotage you've committed against me. It records the exact dates when you began your campaign of mental warfare, the names of the neighbors you fed your lies to, and my growing suspicions about the circumstances surrounding my mysterious fall. Mrs. Whitmore had stepped backward toward the door, clearly recognizing that the situation had taken an unexpected turn that went far beyond her area of professional expertise. But this, I said, reaching behind my pillow again to produce a small voice-activated digital recorder disguised as a decorative brooch, this little device contains something even more valuable than written documentation. I held up the recorder so they could see it clearly, watching as comprehension dawned in their eyes. This holds several recordings of your most revealing conversations, the ones you thought I couldn't hear through my bedroom door, the ones where you discussed your timeline for getting me declared incompetent, your plans for selling my house, and your debate about which facility would be cheapest for my long-term confinement. The silence in the room was absolute and electric, broken only by the sound of Daniel's ragged breathing and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. You wanted to prove my mental incompetence to gain control of my assets and my life, I concluded with quiet satisfaction, but instead you've provided me with all the evidence I need to prove your own cold-blooded criminal conspiracy against a vulnerable, elderly woman. I looked directly into Rebecca's eyes, seeing fear there for the first time since this nightmare had begun. My mind is perfectly clear, my memory is completely intact, and my documentation is thorough and legally admissible. You've just destroyed any chance you ever had of inheriting so much as a single penny from the mother you tried so hard to drive insane. I watched their stunned faces with a satisfaction I hadn't felt in months, observing as the weight of their exposed truth hung heavy in the suddenly silent room. The confident predators who had stalked me through my own home had been transformed into frightened animals, caught in a trap of their own making. Consider this, I stated with a clarity and authority that surprised even me, my voice firm and unwavering, despite the trembling in my hands, the absolute and final end of everything that ever existed between us. You made a deliberate choice to become my tormentors, to systematically destroy my peace and sanity for your own financial gain. I clutched my journal and the small recorder protectively against my chest, these simple objects suddenly feeling like the most powerful weapons in the world. I choose to be free from your manipulation, free from your lies, and free from the burden of loving people who proved themselves capable of such calculated cruelty toward the woman who gave them life. The transformation in their expressions was immediate and dramatic. Rebecca, who had been so confident and controlled just moments before, began stammering like a guilty child caught in an elaborate lie. That's completely impossible. She protested, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. You're making all of this up. A secret journal recordings, that's just more evidence of your mental deterioration. No one will believe these fantasies. Her hands were shaking now as she gestured wildly, her carefully constructed facade of concerned daughter finally cracking under the pressure of exposure. Daniel stood beside her with his jaw hanging open, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion that made him look like the frightened little boy he had once been. The ambitious, calculating man who had helped orchestrate my downfall had been replaced by someone who seemed unable to process what was happening around him. Mrs. Whitmore, the supposed senior care specialist who had been brought in to facilitate my removal, took several quick steps backward toward the door. Her professional demeanor had evaporated entirely, replaced by obvious discomfort and a clear desire to distance herself from what was rapidly becoming a legal nightmare rather than a routine placement. With a surge of newfound strength that seemed to flow through my body like electricity, I managed to stand up from my bed without assistance for the first time in weeks. My legs felt steady beneath me, my spine straight with dignity and purpose I had thought was lost forever. You called me confused. I murmured my voice, carrying a chilling calm that silenced their protests. You described me as frail and incompetent to anyone who would listen. You have absolutely no idea of the strength that resides in a mother who finally decides to fight for her truth and her survival. I walked steadily toward my bedroom door, each step more confident than the last, bypassing their attempts to physically block my path. They seemed frozen by the dramatic shift in power dynamics, unable to comprehend how their helpless victim had suddenly become a formidable opponent. A clear sense of purpose guided my movements. As I made my way through the house they had tried to steal from me, past the furniture they had rearranged to confuse me beyond the walls that had become my prison, through their psychological warfare. Rebecca, apparently recovering from her initial shock, began shrieking with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were crumbling before her eyes. "You'll be living on the streets within a week, you delusional old woman." "Ha!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house with embarrassing volume. "No one will believe your ridiculous stories about being abused. Those recordings are just the confused ramblings of a senile mind, and any court will see that immediately." She followed me through the hallway, her expensive heels clicking frantically on the hardwood floors as she tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. "You're destroying your own family with these insane accusations. We were trying to help you, and this is how you repay our love and concern. Daniel." His voice, weak and uncertain, managed to add his own hollow threat. "Yeah, Mom, you're going to end up locked away in some terrible state institution when people realize how crazy you've become. Nobody's going to take care of you now." But their threats carried no conviction, no real power behind the words. I could hear the dawning terror in their voices as they began to realize that their meticulously planned psychological campaign had not only failed, but had actually provided me with all the evidence I needed to destroy them legally and socially. Mrs. Whitmore, clearly recognizing that the situation had escalated far beyond her area of expertise, quickly gathered her folders and briefcase and headed for the front door without another word. The last thing she wanted was to be associated with what was obviously a criminal conspiracy rather than a legitimate elder care placement. As I reached my front door and placed my hand on the brass knob that I had polished countless times over the decades, I felt a profound sense of liberation washing over me like warm sunlight after a long, dark winter. For the first time in months, I was leaving my home of my own free will, carrying with me the tools I needed to reclaim my life and ensure that justice would finally be served. The quiet pride that filled my chest was more powerful than any emotion I had experienced since David's death, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was not an ending, but the beginning of my fight for vindication and peace. I managed to reach the familiar front door of my dearest friend Margaret's house, 6 blocks away, my legs trembling from both exertion and adrenaline, but my spirit more determined than it had been in months. Margaret Wilson had been my closest colleague during our shared decades at the county library, and she was one of the few people in my life who I knew would listen without judgment and act with decisive support. When she opened her door and saw my disheveled appearance and the desperate urgency in my eyes, Margaret immediately ushered me inside without hesitation or questions. Her living room filled with the same warm atmosphere of books and gentle lighting that had always characterized our friendship felt like a sanctuary after the psychological battlefield my own home had become, with hands that shook only slightly from emotion rather than fear. I showed Margaret my secret journal and played one of the most chilling snippets from my hidden recorder, a conversation where Rebecca and Daniel discussed the exact timing of my expected mental breakdown and their plans for liquidating my assets once I was safely confined to an institution. Margaret's face grew pale as she listened to the cold, calculating voices of my children discussing my destruction as if it were a business transaction. Her eyes filled with tears of outrage and sympathy as she realized the full scope of the psychological torture I had endured. "Evelyn," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "this is criminal elder abuse of the most sophisticated and cruel kind. We're going to stop this immediately, and we're going to make sure they face the full consequences of what they've done to you." True to her word, Margaret immediately activated a network of trusted contacts she had cultivated through decades of community involvement. Within hours, She had connected me with elder care advocates, legal aid specialists, and social workers who specialized in exactly the kind of systematic family abuse I had suffered. With Margaret's unwavering support and guidance, I began the process of pursuing formal charges of elder abuse fraud and psychological terrorism against Rebecca and Daniel. This wasn't about revenge or spite. It was about protecting myself from further harm and ensuring that justice would be served for their calculated cruelty. Working closely with Elena Martinez, a compassionate attorney who specialized in elder rights cases, I began to understand that my careful documentation had created an almost unprecedented legal case. Most elder abuse victims either lack the mental capacity to document their suffering or are too intimidated to take action against their abusers. Elena explained that my journal and recordings represented the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream of finding: clear contemporaneous documentation of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation designed to drive a competent adult to a state of helpless dependency. I also began attending a weekly support group for elder abuse survivors, where I found profound strength and validation in sharing experiences with other victims who had faced similar betrayals by family members they had trusted implicitly. These meetings helped me understand that my situation, while heartbreaking, was not unique, and that recovery and empowerment were genuinely possible. 6 months after that terrible night, when I had finally exposed Rebecca and Daniel's conspiracy, I found myself attending a public hearing on elder abuse prevention in the very courthouse where my legal case was gaining momentum. The hearing was designed to educate the community about the warning signs of family-perpetrated elder abuse and to discuss policy changes that might better protect vulnerable seniors. As I sat in the packed auditorium, wearing a simple but dignified navy dress that Margaret had helped me choose, I felt a profound sense of purpose and belonging that I hadn't experienced since my retirement from the library. I was no longer a victim hiding in fear. I was an advocate and witness whose testimony could help protect other elderly citizens from similar abuse. Then, to my complete surprise, I spotted 2 familiar figures entering the courthouse auditorium. Rebecca and Daniel were there impeccably dressed and attempting to maintain their public facade of respectability. They moved through the crowd with careful confidence, likely hoping to gauge the progress of my case, or perhaps to subtly influence public opinion in their favor. Rebecca spotted me almost immediately, her eyes scanning the crowd with the predatory alertness I had learned to recognize and fear. When our gazes met across the crowded room, I saw her expression shift from surprise to disbelief, and finally to the familiar sneer of contempt that had become her default expression toward me. She immediately began making her way through the crowd in my direction, speaking loudly enough for everyone around her to hear clearly. "Well, well, Mother," she announced with theatrical surprise, her voice carrying that same patronizing tone she had perfected during our worst confrontations. "Still trying to cause trouble for your own family, I see. Are you still telling those ridiculous fabricated stories about being abused and mistreated by the children who tried so hard to care for you?" She paused dramatically, allowing her words to sink in before delivering what she clearly considered a devastating blow. "Really, everyone here should know that no one believes these wild accusations from a confused old woman who can't distinguish between reality and her own paranoid fantasies. Mother has always been prone to dramatic exaggeration, but this recent decline into outright delusion is truly heartbreaking for those of us who love her." Daniel stood silently beside her, looking profoundly uncomfortable, but apparently lacking the courage to either support her attack or distance himself from it. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact with anyone who might be listening to his sister's public character assassination. I remained perfectly calm, meeting Rebecca's hostile stare with the steady composure I had learned during my months of recovery and legal preparation. When I finally spoke, my voice was clear and confident, carrying easily through the sudden quiet that had fallen over our section of the auditorium. "Actually, Rebecca," I replied with the dignity that comes from knowing you possess unshakable truth, "I'm here today as a key witness in a landmark elder abuse case that has attracted attention from legal scholars throughout the region. My testimony, backed by detailed evidence from my personal journal and recorded conversations, will be crucial in establishing new legal precedents for prosecuting family-perpetrated psychological abuse." I gestured toward Elena Martinez, who was seated nearby, and nodded grimly in Rebecca and Daniel's direction as she recognized them from the case files. "And I'm doing quite well, thank you for asking. I'm living comfortably in an independent senior community, fully financially secure, thanks to my lifetime of prudent planning and good sense, qualities that you apparently never learned to appreciate or understand." The effect of my calm, factual response was immediate and devastating. Rebecca and Daniel's faces went completely blank with shock as they realized that not only had I survived their psychological assault, but I had emerged stronger and more determined than ever before. The people around us who had overheard the exchange were now looking at them with expressions of suspicion and disapproval, clearly wondering what kind of children would publicly attack their elderly mother in such a cruel and dismissive manner. My testimony in court 2 weeks later, delivered in a clear, steady voice, while Elena presented my journal and played selected recordings for the judge and jury, led to a swift and undeniable preliminary ruling in my favor. The evidence was so comprehensive and damning that Rebecca and Daniel's attorney actually advised them to consider a plea bargain rather than face a full trial. Judge Patricia Hamilton, a stern woman with decades of experience in family law, ordered an immediate and complete investigation into Rebecca and Daniel's conduct. She also issued a temporary restraining order preventing them from having any contact with me and froze their access to any of my assets while the investigation proceeded. The local media, which had initially covered the public hearing as a routine community interest story, began reporting extensively on what they described as shocking allegations of systematic elder abuse by adult children against their vulnerable mother. The story had all the elements that made for compelling journalism: family betrayal, psychological manipulation, hidden evidence, and a brave victim fighting back against seemingly impossible odds. Rebecca's carefully constructed public image as a devoted daughter, caring for her aging mother, began crumbling as reporters dug deeper into the details of my case. Neighbors who had once admired her apparent dedication to my welfare started coming forward with their own observations about the strange changes they had noticed in my behavior and appearance during the months leading up to my hospitalization. Humiliated by the negative publicity and unable to accept that her elaborate scheme had been so thoroughly exposed, Rebecca made the catastrophic decision to resort to even more vicious public slander. Against her attorney's explicit advice, she called an impromptu press conference outside the courthouse immediately following my preliminary hearing. Standing on the courthouse steps, with tears streaming down her face, Rebecca delivered a performance that was both dramatic and utterly unconvincing to anyone who had heard the actual evidence presented in court. "My poor beloved mother," she wailed, her voice breaking with what appeared to be genuine anguish. She's clearly suffering from severe mental instability and cognitive decline that has caused her to fabricate these horrible, hurtful lies about the children who have sacrificed everything to care for her. She paused to dab at her eyes with a tissue, clearly hoping to generate sympathy from the assembled reporters and camera crews. These recordings she claims to have made are obviously the product of her deteriorating mental state, and she's being manipulated by greedy lawyers who see an opportunity to exploit an elderly woman's confusion for their own financial gain. Anyone who knows our family can tell you that Daniel and I have done nothing but love and support our mother through her declining years. Daniel stood silently beside her throughout this performance, looking utterly miserable and pale with what might have been guilt or simply terror at the legal consequences they were facing. His inability to speak or make eye contact with the cameras spoke volumes about his actual feelings regarding their situation. At Elena's careful advice, I arranged my own statement to the press the following day, delivering my response from the same courthouse steps where Rebecca had staged her theatrical breakdown. My children's desperate attempts to discredit me with false claims of mental instability are simply further proof of their malicious intent and their complete lack of genuine remorse for the psychological torture they inflicted upon me. I stated my voice clear and firm as I looked directly into the television cameras. The journal entries documenting their campaign of gaslighting and manipulation, the recordings of their conversations planning my institutionalization, and the testimony of hospital staff who witnessed their subtle psychological abuse all tell a very different story from the one my daughter would have you believe. Then, with Elena's permission, I played a brief but absolutely chilling snippet from one of my recordings, a conversation where Rebecca could be clearly heard discussing her plans to tamper with my medications to make me appear more confused and disoriented during my next doctor's visit. The effect of hearing Rebecca's own voice calmly planning to drug her elderly mother was devastating to any remaining public sympathy she might have garnered. The media's tone shifted dramatically and immediately from skepticism about my claims to outright condemnation of Rebecca and Daniel's behavior. Mrs. Henderson, the neighbor who had initially supported Rebecca's claims about my supposed mental decline, came forward publicly to retract her previous statements. In a tearful interview with the local news station, she admitted that she had been completely misled by Rebecca's manipulative presentation of the situation and expressed profound regret for contributing to my victimization. Social service agencies and the police began their own independent investigations into Rebecca and Daniel's conduct, looking for evidence of similar patterns of abuse or fraud in their other relationships and financial dealings. The investigation revealed a troubling history of manipulative behavior toward elderly relatives and questionable financial transactions that suggested my case was not an isolated incident. Elena immediately filed intensified charges against both Rebecca and Daniel, including attempted fraud, systematic elder abuse conspiracy to commit financial exploitation and psychological terrorism against a vulnerable adult. She cited their public statements and their recorded conversations as additional evidence of their criminal intent and their complete lack of remorse for their actions. The legal momentum was now entirely on my side, and I felt a calculated satisfaction watching Rebecca and Daniel's world collapse around them just as thoroughly as they had tried to destroy mine. But unlike their cruelty, my pursuit of justice was based on truth evidence and a genuine desire to protect other potential victims from similar abuse. 3 weeks after the media storm surrounding Rebecca's disastrous press conference, my secure phone rang with an unfamiliar number that I almost didn't answer. Elena had advised me to be cautious about taking calls from unknown sources, as Rebecca and Daniel had been trying various methods to contact me despite the restraining order. When I finally decided to answer, I was greeted by Rebecca's voice, but it was Rebecca as I had never heard her before, a mixture of sputtering rage and raw animalistic panic that was both shocking and somehow deeply satisfying. "Mother, what have you done to us?" She screamed into the phone, her voice so loud and distorted that I had to hold the receiver away from my ear. "The police showed up at our door with a search warrant. Our bank accounts have been completely frozen. Our credit cards have been canceled. Daniel lost his job because his employer saw the news coverage." Her breathing was ragged and desperate, like a cornered animal fighting for survival. "This is all your fault, you vindictive old witch. You're going to completely destroy your own children with these insane lies. You have to call off your lawyers and drop all these ridiculous charges immediately, or we'll lose absolutely everything we've worked for." The transformation from her previous cold calculation to this raw desperation was remarkable. The confident predator who had stalked me through my own home had been reduced to a panicking victim of her own choices and actions. "Rebecca," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of the emotion she was trying to provoke. "Your current problems, just like Daniel's employment difficulties, are the direct and inevitable consequence of your own deliberate choices and criminal behavior." I paused, allowing my words to sink in before continuing with the calm authority of someone who finally held all the power in our relationship. "You chose to systematically torture and manipulate a vulnerable elderly woman for financial gain. You chose to risk everything on a scheme that was both morally reprehensible and legally criminal. My actions in seeking justice and protection are simply the natural repercussions of your own depravity and cruelty." I could hear her breathing becoming more erratic as she realized that I was not going to be moved by her rage or intimidated by her accusations. "You made your bed through deliberate cruelty and calculated abuse, Rebecca. Now you must lie in it and face the consequences of your choices like an adult." Her anger quickly dissolved into pathetic, tearful begging that was even more nauseating than her previous threats and intimidation. "Please, Mother, you have to understand. We're losing everything we've ever worked for. The house is going into foreclosure. Daniel's wife is threatening to leave him and take the children. We'll be completely destitute and homeless if you don't help us." Her voice took on that familiar manipulative tone I remembered from her childhood when she would try to escape consequences through emotional manipulation rather than taking responsibility for her actions. "We were just misguided in our approach. We thought we were protecting you from making poor decisions. Can't we sit down and talk about this like a family? Can't we find some way to reconcile and put this whole unfortunate misunderstanding behind us?" She paused clearly, hoping for some sign that her emotional manipulation was working before launching into her most desperate appeal. "Don't you remember how close we all were when David was alive? Don't you want to honor his memory by keeping our family together? For his sake, please, just a little financial help to get us back on our feet. We promise we'll never interfere in your life again, just for old time's sake, for the love we used to share." Her forced endearments and thinly veiled pleas for money were absolutely nauseating, representing a stark contrast to the cold venom she had directed at me just minutes earlier. The speed with which she could shift from threats to manipulation revealed the calculated nature of her emotional responses and confirmed that she had learned nothing from this experience, except that her previous tactics had failed. "Rebecca," I stated with quiet finality, my voice carrying the weight of absolute truth and unshakable resolve. The family you keep referring to ceased to exist permanently the moment you and Daniel plotted my systematic psychological destruction and attempted to steal everything I had worked a lifetime to build. I stood up from my comfortable chair in my peaceful apartment, walking to the window, where I could see the garden that had become a source of daily joy and tranquility. The love and trust that once bound us together was completely destroyed by your own actions and choices. There is nothing left to reconcile because there is no relationship remaining to repair. My voice remained calm and measured, but carried an authority that left no room for argument, negotiation, or further manipulation. You made your choice when you decided that my assets were more valuable than my dignity, my peace, or my right to live safely in my own home. I have now made my choice as well, to protect my hard-won peace and security from any further contact with people who proved themselves capable of such calculating cruelty toward their own mother. With those words, I calmly pressed the end call button, cutting off Rebecca's desperate protests mid-sentence. Then, with a thoroughness that had served me well throughout my professional life, I immediately blocked her number, Daniel's number, and instructed Elena to handle any further contact attempts through legal channels, ensuring that no direct communication pathway remained between us. The silence that followed was profound and utterly liberating. Not the empty quiet of loneliness, but the peaceful stillness of a life finally free from manipulation, exploitation, and the exhausting burden of loving people who had proven themselves unworthy of that love. I felt complete detachment from whatever chaos Rebecca and Daniel were creating in their own lives, absolute empowerment over my own choices and future, and the ultimate relief that comes from finally permanently closing the door on a chapter of life that had brought nothing but pain and betrayal. The sense of impenetrable peace that settled over me felt like armor forged from truth and tempered by justice. Nothing they could ever do or say would be able to penetrate it again. 8 months had passed since that final phone call with Rebecca. 8 months of rebuilding my life and discovering strengths I never knew I possessed. The invitation to deliver the keynote address at the National Conference for Elder Advocacy arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other, but it represented the culmination of a journey I could never have imagined when I was cowering in my own bedroom, doubting my own sanity. The conference was being held in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Convention Center with over 800 attendees, including social workers, legal advocates, healthcare professionals, and policymakers from across the country. My story had become something of a landmark case in elder abuse prevention, and Elena had encouraged me to share my experience as a way of helping other victims recognize the warning signs of psychological manipulation. As I stood backstage, reviewing my notes one final time, I felt a mixture of nervous excitement and profound purpose. The woman who had once been too frightened to leave her own bedroom was about to address a national audience about the importance of fighting back against family-perpetrated abuse. When I walked onto the stage to polite applause, adjusting the microphone and looking out over the sea of faces, I noticed two figures in the back of the auditorium who made my breath catch in my throat. Rebecca and Daniel were there, looking utterly disheveled and gaunt, their expensive clothing replaced by rumpled, ill-fitting garments that suggested they had indeed fallen from whatever grace they had once possessed. They appeared to be attending not as professionals or advocates, but as desperate individuals driven by morbid curiosity, or perhaps some lingering, pathetic hope that they might somehow salvage their reputations, or find a way to approach me despite the restraining orders. I began my prepared speech on the silent epidemic of familial elder abuse, speaking clearly into the microphone about the sophisticated psychological tactics that adult children sometimes use to manipulate and control their elderly parents. My voice was steady and professional as I described the warning signs that family members, healthcare workers, and the elderly themselves should watch for. The most insidious form of elder abuse, I explained to the attentive audience, is the systematic campaign to undermine an elderly person's confidence in their own perceptions and memories. This psychological warfare is designed to make the victim question their own sanity and become completely dependent on their abusers for basic decisions about their lives and care. I was perhaps 10 minutes into my presentation when Rebecca suddenly lurched forward from her seat in the back row, pushing past other attendees with the desperate urgency of someone who had nothing left to lose. She grabbed a wireless microphone from a startled conference usher and began screaming with a shrillness that cut through the professional atmosphere like a serrated knife. "Don't listen to her!" Rebecca's voice echoed through the large hall, amplified by the sound system and clearly audible to every person present. "She's nothing but a liar and a manipulator. She ruined her own children with her vindictive lies and fabricated evidence. She's a disgrace to motherhood and everything this organization claims to represent." Her accusations poured out in a torrent of rage and desperation, each word dripping with the kind of venom that only comes from someone whose carefully constructed world has collapsed completely around them. This manipulative old woman used a fake journal filled with lies to destroy her own family. She turned the legal system against her children, who were only trying to protect her from her own poor judgment. She's standing here pretending to be a victim when she's actually the perpetrator of the worst kind of family destruction. The conference cameras, which had been recording my presentation for later broadcast, continued rolling as Rebecca's unhinged tirade played out before hundreds of witnesses. Daniel stood silently beside his sister, a defeated shadow of his former self, apparently lacking the energy or courage to either support her outburst or distance himself from it. A ripple of shock and uncomfortable confusion swept through the distinguished audience. These were professionals who had devoted their careers to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens. But Rebecca's passionate accusations, delivered with such apparent conviction, created a moment of uncertainty that was both predictable and deeply painful. Some attendees exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes moving between Rebecca and me with expressions of doubt and concern. The weight of these baseless but emotionally charged accusations delivered on such a public stage and captured by live cameras felt like a familiar stab of humiliation that transported me back to those dark days when I had questioned my own sanity. My heart began pounding with the old familiar mixture of shame and terror, but instead of the paralysis that had once overwhelmed me, I felt my resolve solidifying like steel being forged in fire. This public attack was actually an opportunity to demonstrate once and for all the difference between truth and desperate fiction. Despite the escalating humiliation and the uncomfortable murmurs from the audience, I maintained an incredible level of poise and dignity that surprised even me. I allowed Rebecca to continue her performance without interruption, letting her fully expose the depths of her malice and raw desperation to everyone present. My expression remained one of profound sadness rather than anger, conveying the heartbreak of a mother who had been betrayed by her own children rather than the rage of someone seeking revenge. I stood calmly at the podium, waiting patiently for Rebecca to exhaust herself, knowing that her uncontrolled outburst was actually serving my purpose better than any response I could have planned. The cameras continued recording every moment of this extraordinary confrontation, capturing not only Rebecca's hysterical accusations, but also my composed, dignified response to being publicly attacked by my own daughter in front of a national audience of elder care professionals. As Rebecca's voice finally began to fade, growing hoarse from the intensity of her tirade, I calmly stepped forward and gently took the microphone back from the conference organizer, who had been trying to restore order to the proceedings. The auditorium fell into an expectant silence. Hundreds of eyes focused on me with curiosity and growing sympathy as they waited to see how I would respond to such a vicious public attack. "Rebecca," I began, my voice quiet, but somehow managing to resonate through every corner of the large hall, carrying a weight of dignity and sorrow that immediately commanded the attention and respect of everyone present. "You stand here speaking passionately about lies and fabrication, about manipulation and family destruction. Perhaps this is the perfect moment to show everyone present the documented truth about cold blood and calculated cruelty." Behind me, the large projection screen that had been displaying my presentation slides suddenly changed to show official court documents that Elena and I had prepared specifically for such a moment. The first image was a formal legal judgment from the family court, clearly showing that Rebecca and Daniel had been found guilty of systematic elder abuse, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The legal language was technical and formal, but the findings of fact were unmistakable and damning. The court had not only ruled in my favor, but had specifically cited their pattern of sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to undermine the victim's mental stability and independence. Next to the court judgment, I projected magnified images of pages from my secret journal, showing my careful handwriting, documenting their campaign of gaslighting, their tampering with my stair lift, their replacement of my treasured locket with a worthless replica, and dozens of other instances of deliberate psychological warfare. This, I stated clearly, my gaze meeting Rebecca's across the auditorium with unwavering directness, is the court's official verdict on your version of truth. These are not the confused ramblings of a senile mind, but the meticulous records of a trained librarian, documenting every insidious step of your coordinated plot to drive me to complete psychological collapse. I gestured toward the projected journal entries, allowing the audience to see the careful dates, times, and detailed descriptions of the abuse I had endured. These pages represent the systematic documentation of your campaign to steal my home, erase my independence, and destroy my connection to David's memory. You tried to break my spirit and brand me as mentally incompetent, but you fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about the human capacity for resilience. My voice grew stronger and more authoritative as I continued, fueled by months of recovery and the satisfaction of finally being able to tell my complete story to an audience that could understand its significance. Integrity, unlike your heart's, cannot be shattered by cruelty or manipulation. Truth, unlike your fabricated concern, becomes stronger when challenged by lies. My presence here today, my ability to stand before you as a survivor rather than a victim, represents not vengeance, but the ultimate victory of authentic human dignity over calculated depravity. Conference security officers, who had been monitoring the situation since Rebecca's initial outburst, began moving tactfully toward the back of the auditorium as they recognized that the disruption needed to be contained professionally and efficiently. A collective gasp swept through the entire audience as the full implications of the evidence I had presented became clear. These were professionals who had devoted their careers to protecting elderly citizens from exactly the kind of abuse that Rebecca and Daniel had perpetrated, and they could immediately recognize the sophistication and cruelty of the psychological warfare that had been directed against me. The whispered conversations that had begun with uncertainty and doubt now buzzed with outrage and condemnation directed squarely at Rebecca and Daniel. Their names were being spoken openly with disgust and professional disapproval throughout the auditorium as hundreds of elder care advocates realized they were witnessing the perpetrators of one of the most documented cases of family-perpetrated psychological abuse in recent legal history. Monsters, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard by nearby attendees. How could children do that to their own mother? Came from another section of the audience. This is exactly why we need stronger legal protections for vulnerable seniors, observed a third voice with obvious professional authority. Security officers reached Rebecca and Daniel's location and began the process of escorting them from the premises with the kind of firm but respectful efficiency that suggested they had handled similar situations before. The officers were clearly experienced in managing disruptions at professional conferences, and they moved with a combination of authority and discretion that minimized additional chaos. Rebecca's face had become a mask of utter defeat and public humiliation that was almost painful to witness. The confident, manipulative woman who had once controlled every aspect of my daily life had been reduced to a broken, desperate figure whose lies had been exposed before hundreds of professional witnesses and recorded for posterity. Her eyes filled with raw, impotent rage, and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine remorse met mine for one final, devastating moment before she was led away. In that instant, I saw not the predator who had terrorized me, but a profoundly damaged person who had destroyed herself through her own choices and actions. Daniel followed behind the security officers in complete silence, his head bowed in absolute disgrace, his face pale with what appeared to be a combination of shame and terror at the legal consequences that would inevitably follow this public exposure of their crimes. As the auditorium doors closed behind them, sealing their exit from not just this conference, but from any possibility of functioning within honest professional or social communities, a spontaneous round of applause began building from the back of the room and swept forward until the entire audience was on their feet. The applause was not just for my presentation, but for my courage in surviving and exposing the kind of systematic family abuse that destroys so many elderly victims who lack the resources, documentation, or support systems necessary to fight back effectively. 6 months after the conference that had definitively ended, Rebecca and Daniel's ability to function in any respectable social or professional circles, my life had settled into a rhythm of genuine contentment and purposeful activity that I had never experienced before. I was living in Willowbrook Gardens, a supportive, independent living community where residents maintained their own apartments while enjoying access to communal dining, social activities, and assistance when needed. My advocacy work had gained national recognition, and I was frequently invited to speak at conferences, train social workers, and consult on legal cases involving elder abuse. The sense of purpose and community I had found was more fulfilling than anything I had experienced during my years of focusing solely on family obligations. Then, on a quiet Thursday morning, as I was tending to my small balcony garden, an unexpected package arrived at the community's reception desk. The return address was unfamiliar, but something about the careful handwriting made my heart skip with recognition and dread. Inside the package was a single tattered envelope containing a handwritten letter that bore unmistakable signs of having been written under conditions of extreme emotional distress. The paper was cheap and thin, the ink smeared in places as if tears had fallen on it while it was being written. Daniel's handwriting, once confident and bold, had become shaky and uncertain, reflecting the dramatic changes in his circumstances since our last contact. His letter painted a picture of complete devastation that was both heartbreaking and somehow inevitable, given the choices he had made. He wrote about Rebecca's severe mental breakdown following the conference debacle, her subsequent institutionalization in a state psychiatric facility, and his own complete financial and social ruin. He described losing his job, his home, his marriage, and custody of his children as the full consequences of their actions rippled through every aspect of their lives. But beneath the catalog of misfortune, his letter contained what appeared to be desperate appeals for reconciliation that were motivated more by his current desperation than by any genuine understanding of the harm he had caused or authentic remorse for his actions. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he wrote, "but I'm hoping that somewhere in your heart you might find it possible to forgive the terrible mistakes I made. I'm your son, and despite everything that's happened, I still need you in my life." 2 days after the letter arrived, Daniel appeared at Willowbrook Gardens' elegant reception area, looking so utterly broken and emaciated that I barely recognized him as the man who had once stood silently by, while his sister orchestrated my psychological torture. He had clearly lost significant weight. His clothing hung loosely on his diminished frame, and his face bore the hollow, haunted expression of someone who had been systematically destroyed by the consequences of his own actions. The confident, calculating person who had helped plan my downfall had been replaced by a desperate shell of a human being. When the receptionist called to inform me that I had a visitor, I knew immediately who it was without needing to ask. I had been expecting this moment, and I had already decided how I would handle it with the same careful planning that had served me so well throughout this ordeal. I found Daniel standing in the community's beautifully appointed lobby, and the moment he saw me, he fell to his knees on the polished marble floor with the dramatic desperation of someone whose pride had been completely shattered by circumstances beyond his control. "Mom," he choked out, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. "I was so incredibly wrong about everything. Rebecca is gone, probably forever, locked away in a place where she can't hurt anyone else. I've lost everything that ever mattered to me, and I'm completely alone in the world." His voice was broken and barely audible as he continued his desperate plea. "I'm so sorry for everything I did to you, for every moment of pain I caused, for every way I betrayed your love and trust. Please, I'm begging you to forgive me. I'm still your son, no matter how badly I've failed you. I need you more than I've ever needed anyone in my entire life." His performance was pathetic in the truest sense of the word, inspiring pity rather than anger, but it was also transparently calculated to exploit whatever maternal instincts I might still harbor toward him. "I'll do absolutely anything to make this right between us." He continued, his voice taking on that familiar manipulative tone I remembered from his childhood. "Just a little help to get back on my feet, please, for David's sake, if not for mine. Can't we find some way to be a family again? Don't you remember how close we used to be before everything went wrong?" I looked down at this broken man, kneeling on the lobby floor, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness where my love for him had once resided. The pain and anger that had once consumed me had long since receded, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed me to see this situation for exactly what it was. This was not genuine remorse or authentic accountability for the psychological torture he had helped inflict upon me. This was simply another attempt to use emotional manipulation to extract resources and support from someone he had already betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. I allowed him to continue his humiliating performance without interruption, letting him expose the full depth of his desperation and the shallow nature of his supposed remorse. My silence was not cruelty, but simply recognition that his words were ultimately meaningless and that nothing he could say would restore what he had deliberately destroyed. When he finally looked up at me with desperate, expectant eyes, clearly hoping to see some sign that his emotional manipulation was working, I spoke with a voice that was steady, calm, and utterly final. "Daniel," I said my words, carrying the weight of absolute truth and unshakable resolve. "The son I loved and treasured, the family we once shared, died permanently the moment you chose to collaborate with Rebecca in her campaign to break my spirit and steal everything I had worked a lifetime to build." I paused, looking directly into his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had found complete peace with their decisions. "The love I gave you was genuine and unconditional. The sacrifices I made for your happiness and success were real and given freely from a mother's heart. But your betrayal was absolute and calculating, and it revealed the true nature of your character in a way that can never be undone or forgotten." My voice remained calm and measured, but carried an authority that left no room for argument, negotiation, or further manipulation. There is nothing left to reconcile because there is no relationship remaining to repair. You made your choice when you decided that my destruction was an acceptable price for your temporary gain. I have made my choice as well, to protect my hard-won peace and security from any further contact with someone who proved himself capable of such systematic cruelty toward his own mother. With those words, I turned and walked steadily back toward the elevator that would take me to my apartment, leaving Daniel kneeling on the marble floor of the lobby. The sound of the heavy glass doors closing behind me as I entered the elevator was the final punctuation mark on a relationship that had been dead for months, even if Daniel was only now beginning to understand that reality. As the elevator carried me back to my peaceful apartment, I felt a profound sense of completion and closure that was more satisfying than any revenge could have been. I had survived their worst efforts to destroy me, emerged stronger and more purposeful than ever before, and finally achieved the ultimate freedom that comes from completely letting go of people who had proven themselves unworthy of love and trust. My life at Willowbrook Gardens truly blossomed in ways I had never imagined possible during those dark months when I believed my story was ending rather than beginning. I volunteered at the community's small library, organizing reading groups and helping other residents research their family histories using the same methodical skills that had once saved my sanity and my life. I found genuine friendships with remarkable people who cherished my wit and wisdom rather than viewing me as a resource to be exploited. My days were filled with quiet purpose and deep contentment, morning walks through the community gardens, afternoon tea with neighbors who had become dear friends, and evenings spent reading books I chose for pleasure rather than escape. I even started a small gardening club where residents could grow flowers and vegetables together, sharing both the work and the harvest in a spirit of cooperation and mutual support that I had never experienced in my family relationships. My home was no longer defined by a specific house or address, but by wherever I found peace, respect, and genuine human connection. The gentle, trusting woman who had been so easily manipulated by her own children was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, sharper, with a spirit that had been tempered by adversity into something unbreakable. I carried no bitterness toward Rebecca and Daniel, only a profound sense of peace and gratitude for the hard-won independence that their betrayal had ultimately forced me to discover. I had learned that true family is built on love, trust, and mutual respect rather than mere blood relations, and that one's dignity and self-worth are the most precious assets anyone possesses, impossible to steal unless we surrender them voluntarily. The psychological armor I had forged through surviving their cruelest attacks had made me more resilient and self-reliant than I had ever been in my life. The cold blood family ultimately poisons itself through its own cruelty and deception, consuming whatever love and trust once existed until nothing remains but the bitter consequences of their own choices. While betrayal by those we love most can be terrifying and devastating, it can also reveal inner strengths and capabilities far greater than any cruelty directed against us. Protecting your truth, your sanity, and your peace of mind is the most powerful act of self-preservation anyone can perform, ensuring that your spirit remains unbroken, while those who sought to break you are ultimately destroyed by their own malice and greed. I look out at the setting sun from my comfortable balcony, its golden warmth a gentle balm against the memories of those dark days when I questioned my own sanity and worth. My secret journal sits beside me on the small table, a testament to the power of truth and the importance of bearing witness to our own experiences, no matter how painful they might be. What quiet strengths lie hidden within you, waiting patiently to be discovered and unleashed when life demands your greatest courage and resilience.